"Marry my brother instead," the Duke said. Rosamond Halewood, 23 years old and 3 minutes from the altar rail, felt the whole of her arranged future rearrange itself around that single sentence, spoken without a flicker of feeling. Julian Thorne, Duke of Ashcombe, did not raise his voice. He never did. He stood in the vestry doorway of Ashcombe's private chapel with the grey Yorkshire light behind him, his warm, brown eyes as unreadable as a ledger closed at the end of a bad quarter. He said it again, more slowly, as though the sentence required explaining to her the way one explained an entail to a child. "Nathaniel will make you a fine husband. Better, I think, than I would have." There was a version of this moment in which Rosamond wept. There was a version in which she screamed, or fled the chapel, or demanded of her father why she had been traded like a parcel of contested land from one Thorne brother to the other. She did not choose any of those versions. She smoothed the ivory silk over her wrists and looked the Duke directly in his unreadable brown eyes. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said. It would be many weeks before he understood what those 4 words had cost her, and longer still before he came to understand what they had truly cost him. The arrangement had been forged 11 months prior, in the aftermath of her father's ruin. Baron Halewood had gambled away the better part of a modest inheritance on a canal scheme that dried up before the first barge ever floated. The Duke of Ashcombe, newly returned from 2 years abroad, cold-eyed, unmarried, in want of an heir, had offered a solution with the clean brutality of a man closing an account. Marriage to his daughter, settlement of the debts. No affection required, none offered, none to be mistaken for anything softer than what it was. A contract between a bankrupt name and a wealthy one. Rosamond had agreed because there had been nothing else to agree to. She was 23, unromantic by necessity. In the long carriage rides north to Ashcombe Hall, she had told herself that a cold husband, who paid her family's debts, was a considerably better fate than the alternative. The alternative was no husband, and a family disgraced beyond any season's forgiveness. What no one in that house yet understood was that the Duke had never intended to marry her at all. He had intended, from the very hour the settlement was signed, to marry her to Nathaniel. Nathaniel Thorne was 26, the Duke's younger brother by 4 years, gentler in temperament, quicker to laugh, entirely without the title or the fortune that made his brother so devastatingly marriageable. He had spent the better part of the engagement abroad at the family's smaller Cornish holding, returning only 3 days before the wedding. When he returned, he had looked at Rosamond across the breakfast table with an expression she recognized at once as pity. "He means to give you to me," Nathaniel had said quietly, on the second morning when the Duke had stepped out to see to the stables. "He has meant it since the settlement was signed. He told me so in a letter I did not believe until I saw your face and understood you did not know." Rosamond had not known. She had spent 11 months preparing to be married to a Duke who did not love her. She had not prepared herself for the particular indignity of discovering, 3 days before her wedding, but even that cold arrangement had been a lie. She was not, in fact, being married to the Duke at all. She had been quietly passed along to his brother, as though her consent to one Thorne were consent to any Thorne standing nearby when the vows were said. She had wanted, in that moment, to ask why. She had not asked. Strategic patience was the only inheritance her ruined father had left her worth keeping. She spent it now the way she had always spent it, in silence, in observation, in the stillness of a woman calculating rather than weeping. But the season was not yet finished with her. The wedding day arrived grey and close, the kind of Yorkshire morning that could not decide between rain and restraint. Rosamond stood in the vestry in her mother's remade wedding silk and listened. The Duke explained, in the low voice he used for estate business, that she would be married within the hour, only not to him. "You will forgive the alteration," he said. "It was always the intention. I regret that it was not made plainer to you sooner." "You regret the manner," Rosamond said, "not the substance." Something moved behind his eyes then, brief as a struck match, gone before she could name it. The substance was decided before either of us had a say in it, Miss Halewood. I am merely correcting an error in the paperwork. An error in the paperwork. She held that phrase against her ribs like a stone and did not let it show on her face. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said again. She walked past him into the chapel and married his brother within the hour. A congregation of 40 people had come to see a duke wed and left bewildered, having seen something else entirely. Nathaniel was kind. She would give him that. In the accounting she kept privately of every kindness owed and every cruelty endured. He was kind in the carriage afterward, kind at the wedding breakfast. He was kind in the quiet way he told her, once the guests had gone, that he understood this was not the match either of them had been raised to expect. He would ask nothing of her she was not prepared to give. "I am grateful," Rosamond said, and meant it, and was surprised to find that gratitude and grief could occupy the same sentence without either one diminishing the other. That first fortnight taught her the particular geography of a marriage entered sideways. She learned which corridor of Ashcombe Hall caught the morning sun and which stayed perpetually in shadow. She learned that Nathaniel took his tea too sweet and apologized for it every single time, as though the habit were newly discovered rather than lifelong. She learned that the servants below stairs had already formed their own private theory of what had truly happened in that chapel, and were far too well trained to ever voice it above stairs. She learned, too, that a woman married for 11 months to the idea of one man, and then handed at the final hour to his brother instead, carried a particular kind of grief. It had no name in any conduct book she had ever read. It was not widowhood, not jilting, not disappointment, but something adjacent to all three. A mourning for a life that had never actually existed, and therefore could not properly be mourned at all. She did not speak of it. There are griefs that improve with the telling, and griefs that curdle the moment they are given voice, and Rosamond judged this one, correctly, to belong to the second category. Instead, she did what she had always done with feelings too large for the room they occupied. She put them to use. She rose early and walked the tenant farms with the estate steward, learning which fields were let and which lay fallow, which families were behind on rent through misfortune, and which through neglect. The steward, a taciturn Yorkshireman named Hobbs, had served the family 3 decades. He remarked to the housekeeper that the new Lady Nathaniel had a sharper eye for a failing hedge than either Thorne brother had ever troubled himself to develop. She sat with the household ledgers in the evenings, not because Nathaniel asked it of her. It was because a mind that had spent 11 months calculating how to survive a cold Duke's arrangement did not simply stop calculating the moment the arrangement altered its terms. It was the Duke who could not seem to occupy the same house with what he had done. Ashcombe Hall was a vast, cold, handsome thing, 300 years of Thorne ambition carved into grey stone above the moors. In the weeks that followed the wedding, its master began to haunt his own corridors, like a man searching for something he had misplaced and could not name. Rosamond saw him at dinner, composed and correct, addressing her as Lady Nathaniel, with a precision that felt, increasingly, like a wound he was pressing on purpose. She saw him in the library at odd hours, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow, staring at estate ledgers he was not reading. She saw him, once, standing at the edge of the homewood at dusk, entirely still, in the particular attitude of a man remembering something he had told himself he was permitted to forget. Had anyone been watching closely, they might have seen that the Duke of Ashcombe had begun, within a fortnight of his brother's wedding, to regret his own arithmetic. He had married once before, briefly, 5 years past, to a soft-spoken heiress named Eleanor, who had died of a fever before their first anniversary. In the years since, he had built a version of himself constructed entirely to prevent the possibility of loving anyone that much again. Cold contracts, correct arrangements. A brother installed in the role of husband precisely because a brother could love a wife without it costing the Duke anything at all. It had seemed, on the page, an elegant solution. It had not accounted for the fact that he would be required to watch it happen from across a breakfast table for the rest of his natural life. "You have not touched your correspondence in a week," said Mrs. Price, the housekeeper. She had run Ashcombe Hall since before the old Duke's death, and had buried enough Thorn secrets to fill a second library. "Your Grace is not well." "Your Grace is entirely well," the Duke said, in a tone that closed the subject as firmly as a ledger snapped shut. Mrs. Price had known him since he was a boy, too proud to cry at his own father's funeral. She said nothing further, because there are servants who understand precisely when silence is the greater kindness. Rosamond, for her part, had not come to Ashcombe Hall expecting kindness. She had built her own arrangement with the household, with the same ledger-sharp patience that had carried her through 11 months of engagement to a man who had never intended to marry her. She learned the running of the estate faster than anyone expected of a bankrupt baron's daughter. She corrected an error in the tenant accounts that had gone unnoticed for 3 quarters. She spoke to the housekeeper as an equal, rather than a servant to be managed. The staff of Ashcombe Hall had watched countless ladies arrive and depart in service of Thorn ambition. Within a month, they had begun to regard the new Lady Nathaniel with something that was not quite reverence, but was very close to loyalty. She did not weep for the marriage she had expected. She did not rage at the brother who had received her instead of losing her. She did not, though it would have been the easiest thing in the world, allow herself to wonder what might have unfolded had the Duke meant what he first said at the altar rail. A woman who indulged in that particular wondering would find herself undone by a man who had made it entirely clear he intended never to be undone by anyone again. And so, in the careful manner of her kind, she simply lived, competently, composedly, and with a devastating wit. The Duke discovered it quite by accident, one wet evening in October, when he came upon her in the library, correcting his own brother's arithmetic with a dry precision that made even Nathaniel laugh aloud. "You have found her out, then," Nathaniel said to his brother, still laughing, gesturing at the ledger Rosamond had annotated in a neat, unforgiving hand. "She has been quietly running this household better than either of us for a month, and I have been too grateful to mention it." The Duke looked at the ledger. He looked longer at the handwriting. Precise, economical, entirely without ornament, a hand that wasted nothing, not even ink. He looked, longest of all, at Rosamond. She met his gaze without flinching, the way she had met it in the vestry, the way she had met it for 11 months of an engagement that had never once been true. "You have a talent for figures, Lady Nathaniel," he said. "I have a talent for noticing when something has been miscounted, Your Grace," Rosamond said. "It is a smaller gift than it sounds. Mostly it means noticing when a man has told himself a sum that does not add." Nathaniel, still laughing, excused himself to find more brandy. For a moment the library held only the two of them, the fire settling in the grate, the rain finding the windows in long, unhurried streaks. The Duke did not leave with his brother. He stood over the ledger a moment longer than the ledger required. Rosamond, who had spent 11 months learning the exact weight of a Thorn man's silence, understood that he was working up to some question he had not yet permitted himself to ask plainly. "You corrected 3 quarters of tenant accounts my own steward had overlooked," he said finally. "In under a month. Might I ask how?" "You might ask, Your Grace, though I suspect you already know the answer and merely wish to hear me say it aloud." She closed the ledger with a neat, unhurried motion. "A woman raised by a father who gambled away her inheritance learns very early to watch where the sums go wrong. It is not a skill I would have chosen. It has proved, since, rather useful." Something in his face shifted then. Not warmth, not yet, but a kind of attention she had not seen him direct at anyone since the vestry. A recalibration of whatever private ledger he kept of who she was and what she was worth. "My brother is fortunate," he said. The words came out lower than he had perhaps intended, and he seemed, in the instant after saying them, faintly displeased with himself for having said them at all. "Your brother is kind," Rosamond said carefully, watching him. Kindness and fortune are not always the same entry in the same column, Your Grace. I have noticed a great many people prefer to believe they are. It would be many weeks before he understood that she had not been speaking of the ledger. The first crack came on a night in November, when a letter arrived from London bearing news that Rosamond's father had died suddenly of an apoplexy at his club. The household at Ashcombe Hall gathered in the hour after the news, the way households gather around any sudden grief. Awkwardly, tenderly, without quite knowing where to place their hands. Nathaniel offered comfort with the easy warmth of his nature, and Rosamond accepted it with the composed gratitude she offered everything. It was the Duke who found her. Cold, correct, guarded but outwardly courteous. A man who had spent 5 years perfecting the art of feeling nothing where feeling anything might cost him. He found her alone, past midnight, in the small, unheated chapel where she had married his brother. She was sitting perfectly still in the dark, with her hands folded in her lap, and no tears on her face at all. "You need not sit here in the cold," he said. "I am not cold," Rosamond said. "I am calculating." He should have left. He understood, even as he crossed the chapel floor and sat beside her, that a duke did not sit in the dark beside his brother's wife at midnight for any reason that would survive daylight. He sat regardless. The cold of the unheated chapel had settled into the stone long before either of them arrived, and neither remarked upon it. "What are you calculating?" "Whether it is possible to grieve a father who ruined you," Rosamond said, "and love him anyway. The sums do not resolve cleanly. I keep arriving at different answers." "Grief rarely resolves cleanly," the Duke said. "I have found the accounts never balance. One simply learns to live within the deficit." "Is that what you have done, Your Grace? Learned to live within a deficit?" He did not answer for a long moment. In the particular quantity of his silence, Rosamond understood, with the clean clarity of a woman who had learned to read a man's stillness, that she had struck something true and unguarded. She understood, too, that he knew it. "My wife died 5 years ago," the Duke said finally. "Eleanor. A fever in the space of 9 days. I had loved her the way young men love, entirely, without defense, without the sense to keep anything in reserve. When she died, I concluded that the defense had been the error, not the love. I have not made that particular error again." "And so you gave me to your brother," Rosamond said quietly, "so that you might watch a marriage happen in this house, without being required to risk anything in it." The silence that followed was longer than the first, and heavier. The Duke of Ashcombe, a man who had not permitted himself an undefended sentence in 5 years, found himself without a version of the truth that was not simply the truth. "Yes," he said. "That was the arithmetic. I'm beginning to suspect it was poorly done." He did not touch her. He did not say anything further that night that could not survive daylight. In the morning, he was correct and composed at breakfast, addressing her as Lady Nathaniel with the same careful precision as ever, as though the chapel had not happened, as though he had not, for one unguarded quarter-hour past midnight, told a woman who was not his wife the truest thing he had said aloud in 5 years. But an unguarded act of tenderness, witnessed by accident, cannot, once witnessed, be entirely undone. Mrs. Price had passed the chapel corridor at midnight on an errand of her own. Through the half-open door, she had seen the Duke and the new Lady Nathaniel seated together in the dark, not touching, not speaking. It was a silence that Mrs. Price, who had buried the old Duke and the previous Duchess, and enough Thorn secrets to fill a second library, recognized immediately for what it was. She said nothing to anyone, but she began, in small and unremarked ways, to arrange the household so that the Duke and Lady Nathaniel were rarely required to be in a room alone together. If Nathaniel noticed the housekeeper's sudden and inexplicable diligence in this regard, he was too kind, or too occupied with his own contentment, to ask why. Winter closed over the moors in the particular grey manner of the north. Ashcombe Hall settled into a rhythm that anyone observing from outside might have called peaceful. A duke correct at the head of his table, a younger brother happy in his marriage, a new Lady Nathaniel running the household with a competence the tenants had begun to credit. It would have continued in that peaceful arithmetic indefinitely, had Nathaniel not, in the 3rd week of January, received a letter that changed the sum of everything. The letter came from Cornwall, from a solicitor Nathaniel had retained during his years at the family's smaller holding there. It concerned a debt of a different nature entirely, a debt of the heart, incurred before he had ever returned to Ashcombe to be married to a woman he had not chosen. It concerned a widow named Grace Pemberton, whom he had loved quietly and hopelessly for 3 years, and had believed, when he accepted his brother's arrangement, that he had successfully put aside. He had not put her aside. The solicitor's letter informed him that Grace Pemberton, widowed and unencumbered, had at last accepted his long-standing proposal. It was the one he had made before his brother's arrangement had overtaken his life, and the one he had believed she would never answer. It was the one he had never withdrawn, because withdrawing it would have meant admitting, even to himself, what he had truly given up in marrying Rosamond. He had met Grace Pemberton 3 years prior, at a modest assembly in Truro that neither of them had particularly wished to attend. He had loved her from the first quarter hour, with the uncomplicated certainty of a man who had not yet been asked to choose between love and duty. She had been widowed young, left with a small competence and a large independence of mind. She had told him, gently but plainly, that she would not marry a second time merely to be rescued. He had understood. He had waited. He had believed, when the settlement with Rosamond was signed, that waiting had cost him the only thing he had ever wanted for himself, rather than for the family name. Nathaniel came to Rosamond with the letter in his hand, and an expression of such naked, helpless guilt. She understood, before he spoke a single word, that the arithmetic of her marriage was about to be corrected a second time. She had known, in the vague and unspoken way one knows things about a spouse one has not chosen, that there was a shape in Nathaniel's past he did not speak of. There was a certain stillness that came over him when Cornwall was mentioned at dinner. He had a habit of turning conversations gently away from questions of what had kept him so long at the smaller holding, when Ashcombe Hall had needed him. She had not pressed. A woman who had spent 11 months being rearranged according to other people's arithmetic developed, of necessity, a strict policy against demanding accounts she had not been offered freely. "I did not know she would answer," Nathaniel said. "I swear to you I did not know. I married you honestly, Rosamond. I have tried to be a good husband to you, and I believe I have been. But I have loved another woman for 3 years. I did not think it possible she would ever say yes. I do not know what to do with the proposal I made before I understood what marrying you would mean." There are gestures that cost a woman everything to make, and there are gestures that cost her nothing at all, because she has already given away, in 11 months of arrangements and rearrangements, every part of herself that could still be wounded by surprise. Rosamond looked at her husband's guilty, hopeful face. She thought of her father's debts, and the Duke's cold arithmetic, and the vestry, and the chapel at midnight. And she found, to her own considerable surprise, that what she felt was not devastation. It was relief. "Do you love her, Nathaniel?" "With my whole heart. I have loved her since before I knew you existed." "Then you must go to her," Rosamond said, "and I release you from whatever you believe you owe me. I do not believe either of us married the person we were meant to marry. I think we have both known it since the chapel." It was not, by any measure of Regency propriety, a simple thing to unmake a marriage. Rosamond understood, better than most women of her acquaintance, precisely how narrow that particular door stood open. An annulment required grounds the ecclesiastical courts recognized as valid, and a marriage entered winningly, however coldly, was not undone merely because both parties had since discovered their hearts lay elsewhere. But an annulment was not, in this instance, beyond the reach of two families with sufficient fortune and sufficient reason to want the same outcome quietly achieved. The marriage was unconsummated in any sense that mattered to either party. It was entered under circumstances both parties were now willing to characterize honestly to the ecclesiastical courts as a match made under duress of a family's ruin, rather than any true consent of the heart. The Duke, when Nathaniel brought him the matter, listened in silence for a long time, and then said only, "See it done quietly. She has been wronged enough by this family. She will not be wronged further by scandal." What followed would not be spoken of for a generation outside the family's own private accounting. The annulment was obtained with the discreet efficiency of great wealth applied to great embarrassment. Nathaniel departed for Cornwall within the month, to marry, at last, the woman he had loved for 3 years. He left Ashcombe Hall with a gratitude toward Rosamond so complete that he wrote to her every season thereafter, asking after her happiness with a sincerity that owed her much. And Rosamond Halewood, for she was Halewood again, the marriage undone as though it had never occurred, remained at Ashcombe Hall through that final correction. The 11 months of it had changed her in ways no annulment could unmake. She had nowhere else, in truth, to go. The Duke of Ashcombe had asked her, with a formality that did not entirely disguise the urgency beneath it, to remain as a guest until arrangements could be made for her future. The arrangements he had in mind were not the arrangements he named aloud. "You could return to your mother's people in Bath," he said, on an evening in February, standing at the library window with his back to her, watching the last grey light fail over the moors. "Or I could settle an independence upon you, sufficient that you need never marry again unless you wished it. It is the least this family owes you." "Is that truly what you wish, Your Grace? To settle an independence upon me, and see me safely removed to Bath?" He did not answer at once. Rosamond had learned to read his silences the way she had once learned to read a ledger for the error hidden in its sums. She crossed the library floor and stood beside him at the window, close enough that she could hear the particular unevenness of his breath. "I have made 2 catastrophic errors regarding you," the Duke said finally, still not turning. "The first was believing I could give you to my brother and remain untouched by the consequence. The second was believing, these past 3 months, that my silence on the matter constituted restraint. It was cowardice." "And what would restraint have looked like, if not silence?" "Restraint would have looked like never sitting beside you in a cold chapel at midnight and telling you the truest thing I have said in 5 years. I did that anyway. I've been paying the accounting on it every day since." Rosamond did not weep. She did not demand of him the apology she was owed, though she was owed a considerable one. Nor did she offer him the easy forgiveness that would have cost her nothing and him everything. She stood beside him at the window in the failing grey light and spoke with the devastating plainness that had disarmed him first over a ledger and had never once stopped disarming him since. "I do not want an independence in Bath, Your Grace. I have spent 11 months being arranged by this family according to arithmetic that never once consulted me. If you mean to correct your error a 3rd time, I would ask that you consult me on the terms." He turned to her then. In the last of the grey light she saw, for the first time since the vestry, that his warm brown eyes had stopped being unreadable. They had become, instead, entirely legible. The ledger thrown open at last, every column visible. "Then I am asking you," Julian Thorne said. "Not arranging, asking. Rosamond Halewood, will you consider becoming my wife? In your own time, on whatever terms you judge fair, with no settlement, no debt, and no brother standing between us?" "That depends," Rosamond said, "on whether you intend to change your mind by morning." The question landed between them with more weight than she had intended it to carry. She watched it land, watched him understand, in the space of a single indrawn breath, precisely what she was asking and precisely why she was entitled to ask it. He had, after all, stood in a vestry once before, and altered the whole of her future between one sentence and the next, without so much as a private word of warning. She had earned the right to demand better assurance than a duke's composed face could offer on its own. I have spent 5 years changing nothing about myself by morning or by any other hour, and I have found the arrangement considerably lonelier than I let myself admit. I do not intend to begin changing my mind now, when I have finally arrived at the correct sum. You said the same of the arrangement with your brother, that it was the correct sum. I was wrong then. I did not consult the one figure in the equation who might have told me so. I am attempting, Rosamond, not to make that particular error twice. She could have made him wait. She could have extracted, from a duke who had once traded her to his brother without warning, every measure of patience and courtship a wronged woman was entitled to demand before granting her answer. She considered it, in the brief and private accounting she kept of every debt owed her. She found that she did not want to spend the winter proving a point she had already, in her own heart, settled. "Then you had best write to your solicitor," Rosamond said, "and inform him that the family has one further correction to make to its arrangements. And Julian," she held his gaze, "you will consult me on the settlement this time, in full, before a single line of it is drawn." "I would not dare do otherwise," the Duke of Ashcombe said. For the first time in 5 years, something in his composed and correct face broke entirely open. Mrs. Price, passing the library door a moment later on an errand she would afterward claim to have forgotten, would describe it as the look of a man who had finally balanced his books. They were married in the same small chapel in April, before a congregation considerably smaller and considerably more informed than the one that had gathered in confusion the previous autumn. This time there was no error in the paperwork, no brother standing in the place a duke ought to have stood, no cold arithmetic dressed up as consideration. Rosamond wore her own silk, chosen by her own hand. When Julian Thorne spoke his vows, he spoke them the way he had once, briefly, in a cold chapel at midnight. He spoke the truest sentence of his adult life, without defense, without reserve, and entirely undone. 20 years later, when their eldest daughter came to be married in that same chapel, Rosamond would tell her, privately, the whole of the story. The vestry, the brother, the ledger, the chapel at midnight. Her daughter would ask, wide-eyed, how she had ever forgiven a man who had first tried to give her away to someone else entirely. "I did not forgive the arrangement," Rosamond told her. "I corrected it. There is a difference, and a woman does well to learn it early. A man's first arithmetic is rarely his last, and it is never obliged to be his best. What matters is whether he is willing, when the sum comes out wrong, to sit down and do the accounting properly, in full view, with nothing held in reserve." Her daughter, who had inherited her mother's ledger-sharp mind and her father's warm brown eyes, would remember that answer for the whole of her own long marriage. She would tell it, in turn, to a daughter of her own. The correction Rosamond Halewood had once demanded of a cold duke in a failing grey light became, in the family's private accounting, the truest inheritance Ashcombe Hall ever passed down. It was worth considerably more, in the end, than any settlement, any title, or any entail the estate had ever recorded in its books.